When you think of backpacking in the US, you often think of remote, vast wildernesses, a lot of solitude, and time by yourself. Whereas if you think of backpacking in Europe, it's often historical villages, refuges, and more interpersonal connections. But ultimately, those lines are a lot blurrier than you'd think. You can still find lots of solitude, vast wildernesses, and the same kind of experience you'd find in North America in Europe. You just have to know where to look. Hi, my name is Lauren, and I've hiked tens of thousands of kilometers across the US and Europe, including trails like the Pacific Crest Trail and the Colorado Trail in the US, and the Hexatrek and the Via Dinarica in Europe. And with all of those kilometers, I can definitively tell you which is better, the US or Europe, so let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is trail culture. When you think of backpacking in the US, you're probably thinking about the Triple Crown trails, the PCT, the CDT, or the AT. The US already has a really defined trail culture. You're going to find things like trail families, trail magic, trail angels, and a big sense of community. And the truth is, while you can find those things in European hiking trails, it's going to be a bit different than you expect. Europe, of course, is made up of different countries, cultures, and languages, so you're having to navigate all of those depending on which trail you're choosing to hike. For instance, when I was hiking the Via Dinarica earlier this year, I had to cross through 5 different countries, starting in Slovenia, moving to Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and then to Albania. So that is 5 different languages, 5 different cultures, and 5 different sets of rules for what I'm allowed to do on the trail. Because the US has such a defined trail system and trail culture, when you're setting off on an American thru hike, you pretty much know what to expect. It's pretty straightforward to get your permits, you know where to start, where to end, and more or less where to camp along the way. Depending on which European country you're choosing to hike in, these things can be a little less straightforward. Not to mention, you might have a language barrier to deal with. In my experience, I've found that while hiking through different countries in Europe, permitting is not usually an issue. Wild camping can be an issue because it's a little less clear on where you're allowed and when you're allowed to do those things. And that can be really frustrating because the last thing you want to be dealing with is law enforcement when you're in a foreign country speaking a foreign language. While hiking long trails in the US, you're going to find a pretty clear and defined culture, especially on these long thru hiking trails. Most of the people you encounter will be hiking the whole trail or at least attempting to. Whereas hiking in Europe, because there are so many trail networks, you're going to find it a little harder to meet other people who are hiking your specific trail all the way through. And this can have an impact on the trail culture. So for example, when I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, I don't think I camped alone a single night for the entire trail. However, on the Hexatrek, I spent probably 2 months hiking by myself. While hiking the Hexatrek, I found it difficult to find other hikers who were doing the whole trail. I probably spent at least 8 weeks out of the, 120 days that I was on the trail camping solo. So my answer for which is better in regards to trail culture is it depends what you're looking for. Are you looking for a big trail family and lots of trail culture, including trail magic and assistance? Or are you looking for something a little more solitary, where maybe there aren't so many people through hiking the trail and you can kind of make your own experience? Now, I guess the question is, which one do I think is better? And my cop-out answer is that I really like them both. I love the culture of the American long trails. I love making friends and building community, but sometimes I also want to be left the hell alone. So the second point I want to talk about is trail infrastructure. How does it differ between Europe versus the US? Now, it might seem unusual to want to talk about infrastructure on a hiking trail, because what? You just need a backpack and a tent and a way to go? But there's a lot more that goes into a hiking trail than just a backpack and a tent. So infrastructure can include things like, where are the resupply stops? Are there refuges or huts available? Is wild camping allowed? And things like that. So let's talk about one of the most common misconceptions about European hiking. I think when people think about European hiking, they're often imagining a bunch of refuges and dinners every night and an espresso in the morning. And while that may be true for some trails, it's not the reality for most European hiking trails. And if you're thinking about some of the really popular trails in Europe, like the Tour de Mont Blanc, of course that's going to be the case. The trade-off there is that there are huge crowds. The more resources and infrastructure there are, usually the more people there will be. So yes, if you're looking at doing a trail like the Tour de Mont Blanc, you're going to have resources everywhere. You're also going to have people everywhere, but it really depends on what you're looking for. There are plenty of other countries in Europe that have more of a wilderness experience, so if you're looking to get away from the crowds and experience the true wilderness of Europe, you can definitely find that if you're looking for it. I was definitely able to find that on some pieces of the Hexatrek, like in the Pyrenees, as well as on the Via Dinarica through sections of Croatia and Montenegro. But then the flip side of that is that the infrastructure is not there, and often that means that the trails are unmaintained, then you do a lot more bushwhacking and getting lost. But then similarly on the US trails, if you're hiking the more popular ones like the PCT or the AT, you're gonna have tons of resources at your disposal, including things like trail angels, shuttles, shelters, resupply points, trail magic. Whereas if you're hiking something like the CDT, you're getting more of a true wilderness experience and need to be more self-reliant. So at the end of the day, yes, there are differences. The US, you're getting more of a wild experience, larger gaps between trail towns, larger gaps between resupply points and places of refuge, whereas most European trails, you're gonna have resources closer together. You're gonna be able to resupply 1 to 2 days. You're gonna be able to find roads or, civilization a little more often. So it really depends, again, on what you're looking for. In my personal preference, if I had to pick a favorite, I prefer the US style. I find that the refuges are often overcrowded. I prefer sleeping in my tent outside, and I come to the wilderness to experience the wilderness. So my preference is to be in the wilderness. All right, that's enough about infrastructure. Let's talk about wild camping. And this one's important because the last thing you want to have happen is getting arrested or fined while camping in a foreign country. While hiking an American long trail, the rules on wild camping are usually pretty clear. If you have a permit to hike the trail, you're generally permitted to camp along it. The same cannot be said for European trails. Again, because Europe is made up of so many countries and so many different legal systems, depending on which country or even which county you're in, the rules might differ. So when I was hiking the Hexatrek, for example, France is a great country for long distance hiking because they have freedom to wild camp just about anywhere. They have bivouac laws that are easy to understand and easy to follow. However, hiking in Croatia, for example, it was a little more convoluted. Personally, I was never quite sure if I was allowed to camp where I was camping, and that made it just a little bit stressful to go to sleep every night. Technically, wild camping is illegal in much of Europe, but it's sort of a gray area where if you set up at sunset and you leave at sunrise, probably no one will give you trouble, but the probably is where the problem lies. And again, all of this is hypothetical. To the immigration officers watching this video, I never camped illegally. I would also never encourage you to camp illegally. Oftentimes it's not legal, but it's tolerated, and it's just a bit of a gray area. So it kind of depends on your comfort level for discomfort. Wild camping in Europe is often about discretion, timing, and respect, not about entitlement. So my advice in this situation is just to make sure that you do your research, as well as talking to locals. I often came across situations where I wasn't sure if I was allowed to camp somewhere, but asking clarified that. Most of the time, someone local would say, yep, that's no problem, go ahead. Or they would recommend somewhere else that I could camp that I would be okay with. So then which is better? While hiking in the US, you have the permit system to deal with, which can honestly be a real pain in the ass. But once you have that permit, you know where you're allowed to camp and the rules are really clear cut. Europe, okay, they don't have a permitting system, but the rules vary by country and they're a little harder to understand. Personally, I kind of love not having to worry about where I'm sleeping at night and knowing that where I put my tent up is somewhere that I'm allowed to be. So I'd probably prefer the US style on this one. And fourth, we can talk about the difference between the wilderness itself. How does nature differ in the US versus different countries in Europe? So when hiking in the US, I found that the biomes themselves are just larger, right? If you're on the PCT, for example, you're gonna be in the desert for something like 700 miles. And that's a long time to be in more or less the same atmosphere, views. Whereas when I hiked the Hexatrek across France, I was actually really surprised by how quickly the landscape changed and how diverse it was. I felt like every 100 kilometers, I was somewhere completely different. The landscape in the Alps is very different from the landscape in the Pyrenees, and it's also very different from the Vosges, which are the low-lying mountains close to Switzerland. And in the US, of course, your major trails are going to be very different as well. The PCT is different from the CDT, which then is very different from the AT as far as the nature and the views and what you're going to see. In the US, you're also going to have large stretches with no human presence. You might go multiple days without seeing people or the impact of people. Whereas if you're hiking in most countries in Europe, you're going to see more evidence of human interaction. You're going to see maybe grazing flocks of sheep or cattle. You might find shepherding huts or old roads, but you're going to see more of a human impact on most of these trails. So again, as for which is better, you tell me. I love the vastness of the US trail system and just how alone you can feel out there. I love that feeling of being like, there are 8 billion people on the planet and I'm the only one standing right here. I love that feeling. But I also love how quickly the landscapes can change on a European thru hike. I love that I get to see so many different places so quickly. So again, a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I feel like it kind of depends what you're looking for. Yeah, I love both of them. But as far as like getting the most bang for your buck, I might have to go with European trails on this one. And fifth, let's talk about bang for your buck. If you're gonna travel all the way to Europe, you're probably gonna wanna see more than the trail. Because Europe is so interconnected and it has such good public transportation, I found it really easy to hop off trail and do a little side quest here and there. For example, when I was hiking the Hexatrek, I finished stage 5 and felt like I needed a little bit of a reset. So I was able to take a train into Toulouse and actually go see a rugby game and then return to trail within like 2 days. And you're maybe not going to have that opportunity so often on some of the bigger, more remote trails in the US. I mean, if you're hiking the PCT, sure, you can get off trail and hitchhike into Portland, but it might not be quite as culturally rich of an experience. On the flip side, while I was hiking in Croatia, I decided to hitchhike out to the coast and spend a few days just by the Croatian sea, and that was super beautiful. I'd been bushwhacking for like a week and I needed a break, so I hitchhiked all the way to the coast and then sat by the ocean for like 3 days to reset, and I don't think that's really available on most of the US trails. So as far as side questability goes, I'm gonna have to give this one to the European trails. So with all of that said, who's the clear winner? So for the last couple of years, I've spent a lot more time hiking in European countries than I have in the US. And I find that I love personally that I can combine tourism with hiking. I get to explore countries I've never been to, I get to see landscapes I've never seen, and I kind of love the challenge of navigating trails in another language. I think that's a lot of fun. However, I do sometimes miss the vastness of the landscapes here in the US, as well as the trail culture. You know, I love a trail family. I love how kind of like dirty and gritty it is to hike on the trails here. And I love that there are things like trail angels and just generally an established culture that I really love being a part of. Honestly, I've had amazing experiences hiking in both places, both in Europe and here in the US. And so I'm having a really hard time choosing, so I'm just not going to. The better place really just depends on which chapter of your life you're in. So I'll go ahead and ask you the question, where would you rather hike and why? Or if you've already hiked in Europe, what was your favorite long trail? So again, my name is Lauren, or Long Way on the Trails, and happy hiking.